Many people live with the idea that the rapture is a distant event that could happen at any moment, a sudden disappearance where nothing has to happen beforehand. A kind of immediate escape that will free them from everything that is coming on earth. But when you stop to carefully examine the words of Jesus, not what traditions say, not what is repeated on social media, but what is actually written, you find something unsettling, something that completely shatters that expectation. Because Jesus never spoke of an exit without signs. He never taught that his people would be gathered into total calm without anything preceding that moment. On the contrary, he was very clear in warning that before his coming there would be a specific scenario, a dangerous spiritual environment, a global condition where deception would not be isolated but dominant, where truth would be distorted and many, even within the faith, would be confused. And this is not a forced interpretation, it is directly in his words. Because the first thing Jesus mentions when he speaks of the end is not catastrophes, not wars, not destruction, but something much more subtle and more dangerous. He says, "See that no one deceives you," presenting deception as the initial sign, as the ground where everything else occurs, which means that before any gathering, before any transformation, there is a process that the world goes through. And that process is not comfortable, it is not easy. It is a time when the false resembles the true so closely that only the steadfast will be able to discern. And this is where the part that almost no one is considering comes in. Because if that time comes first, then the preparation isn't to escape immediately, but to stand firm in the midst of that scenario. And if someone ignores this, if someone clings to an expectation that Jesus never promised in that way, they run the risk of not recognizing what's happening right before their eyes, of thinking that something is out of place, when in reality everything is happening exactly as foretold. That's why this isn't an optional or secondary issue. This defines how you prepare. How do you interpret the times and how do you react when you see that the world isn't improving, but rather entering a stage where the truth begins to be replaced by comfortable versions? Because if you don't understand what's coming first, you might believe you're ready, you might feel secure. But when that moment arrives, when that atmosphere fully manifests, you might realize too late that you weren't prepared for what Jesus had already warned about. The problem isn't that there are different views on the rapture, because that has always been the case. The real problem is that most people have built their beliefs more on what they've heard repeatedly than on what is actually written. And that's dangerous because when an idea becomes popular, it begins to feel like truth, even if it has never been examined in light of Scripture. Today, many claim with complete certainty that they won't be present in any kind of difficult scenario, that they will be removed before any global deception, before any major spiritual crisis. But when you calmly analyze the teachings of Jesus and the apostles, you realize that this certainty often doesn't come from deep study, but from an assumed interpretation, from an inherited teaching that almost no one questions. And this is where things get tricky, because the Bible doesn't call us to repeat ideas, but to examine them, to test them, to hold fast to what is good. And when that process doesn't happen, the believer is left vulnerable, not necessarily because they want to be wrong, but because they never stop to check. They never compared what they believe with what the texts actually say. And meanwhile, the world is moving toward an increasingly confusing scenario, where the truth doesn't disappear all at once, but is mixed up, diluted, presented attractively, but distorted, exactly as Jesus warned. And that's where many won't know how to react because they were expecting something else. They were expecting to be removed before facing it. They weren't prepared to discern it. They weren't trained to stand firm in the midst of that environment. And that creates a dangerous clash between expectation and reality. Because when what you expect doesn't match what happens, you can doubt. You can become confused, you can even be swept away by what seems right, but isn't. Therefore, this topic is not just another theological discussion, not a simple debate between positions, it is a matter of real preparation, of understanding whether your faith is based on a comfortable idea or on a conviction proven by Scripture. Because if your foundation is weak, any wind or doctrine moves you. Any convincing discourse shakes you. But if you are firm, even if the environment changes, even if the deception increases, even if the pressure grows, you remain. And that is exactly what Jesus was pointing to. Not a superficial faith that depends on favorable circumstances, but a faith that endures, that discerns, and that is not swept away. And the question that arises here is uncomfortable, but necessary. Have you truly examined what you believe, or have you simply accepted it because you've always heard it that way? Because how you face what's to come depends on that answer. When Jesus spoke about the end times, he didn't do so vaguely, nor did he leave the order of events to the imagination. On the contrary, he was specific in pointing out that before his coming there would be clear spiritual signs that would mark the atmosphere of the world. And among all of them, one stands out above the rest, a persistent warning that is repeated and that many overlook because it isn't spectacular at first glance, but it is profoundly dangerous: deception. Not a small or isolated deception, but a widespread, convincing, and progressive one, capable of infiltrating even spaces where truth is supposed to reign. That is why Jesus said, "See that no one deceives you," not as a light suggestion, but as a top priority alert, making discernment an urgent necessity for those who would live in that time. And this connects directly with what the apostles later develop more clearly. Because it's not just about the world being deceived, but that within the very context of faith something even more serious will occur, an apostasy, a turning away from the truth, not necessarily with an open denial from the beginning, but with a progressive deviation, where the truth is replaced by more comfortable, more acceptable versions, more aligned with what people want to hear. And this fits perfectly with what is described in 2 Thessalonians, when it is stated that that day will not come without this apostasy occurring first and the man of lawlessness being revealed, which establishes an order that cannot be ignored. First, there is a spiritual decline. First, there is a setting of the stage. First, there is a distortion of the truth that allows deception to grow unchecked. And then come the more visible events. But what's shocking is that this process doesn't begin abruptly, it begins almost imperceptibly, with small changes, slight alterations, teachings that sound correct but have been subtly diverted. And that's where many fail to realize what's happening because they aren't watching, they aren't comparing everything with Scripture, they aren't paying attention to the signs that Jesus clearly established. And meanwhile, the atmosphere continues to develop, apostasy continues to spread, deception becomes increasingly sophisticated, and what was once obvious now becomes confusing. The truth seems extreme, and the distorted seems reasonable. And in the midst of all this, the context is being prepared where the coming will finally occur, which means that the rapture is not it happens in a vacuum, not in a neutral world, but in the midst of a scenario previously transformed by this spiritual process. And understanding this completely changes the perspective, because it is no longer about waiting for an event disconnected from everything else, but about recognizing the signs that precede it, identifying the atmosphere that announces it, and above all, not being part of those who are dragged along by that progressive deception that Jesus warned about so clearly. If we completely set aside human opinions and go directly to what is written, what we find is not confusion, but a clear structure that is consistently repeated from the words of Jesus to the teachings of the apostles. In Matthew 24, when the disciples specifically ask him about the sign of his coming and the end of the age, Jesus does not respond with mystery or open-ended ideas. He begins by establishing a precise order, and the first thing he mentions is not natural disasters or visible conflicts, but a profound spiritual warning. See that no one deceives you, by placing deception as the foundation of the final scenario. He then describes how that deception spreads through false Christs and false prophets, followed by wars, rumors of wars, famines, and earthquakes. But he clarifies that all this is only the beginning of sorrows, indicating that there is a progressive process, not an instantaneous event. Later, he speaks of persecution, betrayal among people, widespread hatred, and the cooling of love among many, which clearly shows that believers are not removed before this context, but are present within it, resisting and remaining steadfast. And it is in that same discourse that Jesus says that whoever perseveres to the end will be saved, connecting salvation with perseverance in the midst of that scenario. And then, in a key statement that many overlook, he affirms that immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sign of the Son of Man will appear, and he will send his angels to gather his elect, establishing an order where first there is tribulation and then comes the gathering, which leaves no room for an interpretation of prior escape without context. But this doesn't stop at Jesus' words. Because when we go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul reinforces this same pattern with even more clarity, exhorting us not to be easily shaken regarding that day, and stating directly that it will not come without the apostasy occurring first. The man of sin will be revealed, confirming that there are essential events preceding that moment. Furthermore, it adds that there will be a deceptive power that will lead many to believe the lie because they did not love the truth. This fits perfectly with Jesus' initial warning about deception, showing complete continuity between both messages. And when we add the panorama of Revelation, we see the development of a system that dominates, deceives the nations, and exerts pressure on the faithful. This completes the picture of a spiritually transformed world before the final manifestation. Therefore, by bringing these passages together without forcing them, what emerges is a coherent sequence where first there is deception, apostasy, and pressure, and then the coming and the gathering, showing that Scripture does not teach an isolated event without context, but a process that sets the stage, where faithfulness is tested, and where only those who remain steadfast will be able to discern what is happening when you put all these pieces together without forcing them and without imposing external ideas. What is beginning to take shape is not a complicated theory, but a clear order that completely changes how many have understood this topic, because it is no longer about isolated events or loose interpretations, but a consistently repeating sequence. First, an environment where deception grows and becomes normalized. Then, an apostasy where many turn away from the truth. Next, a more visible manifestation of that system that opposes God. And finally, the coming and gathering of the elect. And this is key to understanding because it redefines expectation. It is no longer a passive waiting, thinking that nothing will happen beforehand, but an active vigilance, recognizing the signs that precede it. And this is where many go wrong, because they have separated the rapture from the context that the Bible itself provides. They have turned it into an independent event when in reality it is connected to a whole previous development, and by disconnecting it, they lose the ability to discern the time in which they live because they expect something immediate while the real scenario is unfolding before them. And this is no small mistake because it directly affects spiritual preparation. If you believe you will not face deception, you do not prepare yourself to discern. If you think you will not see pressure, you do not strengthen your faith to resist. But when you understand the correct order, everything changes, because you begin to see each sign, not as something that takes you by surprise, but as part of what has already been announced. And that positions you differently. You no longer react with fear or confusion, but with clarity, knowing that what is happening is not out of control, but within the framework that Scripture described. And this also reveals something important. The focus is not on escaping as soon as possible, but on remaining faithful until the appointed time. Because the promise was never the absence of difficulty, but the presence of God in the midst of it. And this aligns perfectly with the entire message of the New Testament, where there is a constant call to perseverance, to stand firm, to not be shaken, to resist to the end, which confirms that preparation is not to completely avoid the process, but to go through it without being defeated. And when you understand this, the rapture ceases to be an expectation disconnected from reality and becomes the culmination of a process where unwavering faith has been tested, where deception has been exposed, and where those who remained steadfast are finally gathered. This not only gives meaning to the order of events, but also gives depth to the purpose behind them. And this is where this ceases to be mere information. And it becomes personal, because no matter how much knowledge you have or how many times you've heard about these topics, if you're not spiritually prepared to discern deception and stand firm under pressure, all of this becomes theory without real impact. Jesus didn't warn about these things to satisfy curiosity, but to awaken conscience, so that each person would examine their condition, their foundation, and their relationship with the truth. Because the danger has never been only what happens outside, but how you respond to it. And the problem is that may have built a sense of security based on untested expectations. They have believed that everything will be easy, that they will not face moments where their faith is shaken, that they will not have to choose between standing firm or giving into pressure. But Scripture shows another reality, one where faithfulness is tested, where the truth will not always be popular, and where standing firm will require real conviction, not momentary emotions. And this is what makes this warning so serious, because if someone is not prepared to discern, they can be swept away without realizing it. Deception doesn't come by saying it's a lie, it comes disguised, adapted, aligned with what seems right. And that is why Jesus insisted so much on watching, on being vigilant, on not being deceived, because he knew there would be a time when falsehood would be so convincing that only those who truly know the truth could stand firm. And this leads us to an uncomfortable but necessary question: what is your faith really based on? On what you have always heard or on what you have deeply examined? Because when that moment arrives, there will be no time to improvise. It will not be a scenario where you can stop and investigate from scratch. It will be a time when what lies within you will determine how you respond. And if your foundation is weak, if your relationship with the truth is superficial, if your faith depends on everything being calm, then any change in the environment can destabilize you. But if it is firm, if you have developed discernment, if you know the word not just by hearsay, but through practice, then even if deception increases, even if the pressure grows, even if the atmosphere changes, you do not move, you remain. And that is exactly what Jesus was looking for in his disciples. Not followers who depended on ideal conditions, but people who remained faithful regardless of the context. That is why this warning is not meant to generate fear, but to provoke preparation. It is not meant to alarm, but to awaken. Because the time when faith will be tested is not something distant in theory. It is a reality that is gradually forming, and with each passing day it becomes more evident to those who are attentive. That is why the final question is not whether all this will happen, because it is already written. The question is whether you will be ready when it happens. Whether you will have the discernment to recognize what others will not see and the steadfastness to remain when others stray. Because in the end, it will not be the one with the most information who will remain, but the one who has built their faith on the truth and has decided to stand firm no matter what happens around them. And at the end of all this, there is a truth that cannot be ignored, a truth that defines not only how you understand the times, but how you choose to live from now on. Because the question was never simply when the rapture will occur or at what exact moment things will happen. The real question has always been, whether you will be ready when all of this unfolds as it was foretold. Because if the words of Jesus and the rest of Scripture make anything clear, it is that this is not an isolated event that appears out of nowhere, but the culmination of a process where deception grows, where faith is tested, and where each person reveals what it is truly based on. And this completely changes the perspective, because you are no longer passively waiting for something to happen. You are actively preparing yourself to discern, to stand firm, and not to be swept away by a system that grows ever more convincing. And this is where many fail without realizing it, because they believe that being ready is simply having information or having heard about certain topics. But true preparation is much deeper. It is an inner transformation. It is a relationship with the truth that is not dependent on emotions or circumstances. It is a conviction that remains even when everything around you becomes confusing. Because the time will come when what is right will not be popular, when what is true will not be the most accepted, and when standing firm will mean going against the grain. Clears throat, and if your faith is not rooted, if you haven't developed discernment, if you haven't learned to recognize the truth for yourself, That moment can confuse you more than you can imagine. That's why Jesus didn't just talk about future events, he constantly spoke of watching, of being alert, of not falling asleep spiritually, because he knew that the greatest danger would not be the lack of signs, but the lack of preparation to interpret them correctly. And this brings us to something very clear, Bug. It's not about living in fear, it's about living with clarity. It's not about being alarmed all the time. It's about being awake, aware of what is happening, and aligned with the truth. Because when you understand the order, when you recognize that some things must happen first, you stop being surprised by the process and begin to see it as confirmation of what has already been said. And that gives you stability, it gives you direction, it gives you a different way of facing reality. And in the midst of all that, there's a decision each person must make, whether to continue clinging to comfortable, unexamined ideas, or whether to delve deeper, to search, to confront what they believe with the word to ensure its foundation is solid. Because in the end, it won't be the one who heard the most messages who will remain. It will be the one who took what they heard seriously and applied it to their life, the one who decided to prepare, the one who developed discernment, and the one who chose to stand firm, even when it wasn't easy. And if you've gotten this far listening to this, it's not by chance, because now you have clarity, now you know there's a process. Now you understand that deception isn't optional, but part of the scenario that precedes that moment. And that places you in a position of responsibility because you can no longer ignore it, you can no longer say you didn't know. Now the decision is yours, whether you prepare yourself or simply carry on as if nothing happened. And that's why I want to leave you with this. Don't wait for everything to unfold before taking your spiritual preparation seriously. Don't wait for the atmosphere to change before seeking firmness. Begin now. Examine what you believe. Strengthen your relationship with the truth. Learn to discern. Stay alert, clear as throat, because when that moment arrives, it won't be a time for improvisation, it will be a time for perseverance. And those who have understood this will not be confused, they will not be lost, they will stand firm, knowing that everything is happening just as foretold, and ready for that final moment, which will not be a surprise to those who have been watching, but the fulfillment of that for which they have been preparing all this time. If this message truly made you reflect, I want to read your thoughts below. Tell me in the comments what you think about this, if you believe we are living in this time that Scripture speaks of. Above all, write, I stand firm if your decision is not to be led astray by deception, no matter what happens, because I want to know how many are determined to stand firm until the end.